Hi, everyone. My name is Ben Lau, Director of the Chinese American Museum of Chicago. I am so grateful to welcome you all to this virtual event. We are the only Chinese American museum in the Midwest. Our mission is to advance the appreciation of Chinese American culture through exhibitions, education, and research, and to preserve the past, present, and future of Chinese Americans primarily in the Midwest. Located in San Francisco Bay, the Angel Island Immigration Station served as the main immigration facility on the West Coast of the United States from 1910 to 1940. Many immigrants from China or other Asian countries were detained there for extended periods, thanks to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 and other discriminatory immigration laws. Immigrants from China began arriving in large numbers in the United States in the wake of the gold rush. Some worked as miners, others got jobs on farms, in textile factories, or building the Transcontinental Railroad. At that time, the federal government did little to regulate immigration, instead leaving it up to the states. But the growing influx of immigrants from both Europe and Asia, federal authorities decided to step in, especially after the economic downturn in the 1870s, led many Americans to blame immigrant workers for their misfortunes. In 1875, Congress passed the Page Act, which blocked entry to Chinese, Japanese, and other Asian laborers brought involuntarily to the United States, as well as Asian women brought for the purposes of prostitution. The Page Act was followed by the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which barred Chinese laborers from coming to the United States, limited immigration to those who already had relatives living in the country, and prevented Chinese immigrants from becoming naturalized citizens. Under the Chinese Exclusion Act, U.S. immigration officials were required to inspect each Chinese passenger who arrived by boat in San Francisco before they could be allowed on land. As this process often took more than a single day, passengers were initially detained on steamships anchored in the harbor for that purpose. In 1892, a building near the harbor was converted to a detention shed, which often become overcrowded and dirty and unsanitary. When Congress finally appropriated funds for the construction of an immigration facility in San Francisco, Angel Island was considered the ideal location. Although I have been to San Francisco a few times, I have never been to Angel Island. Needless to say, I didn't have a chance to see the immigration facility. Luckily, today we are able to join the tour to the facility virtually. We are so happy to have Casey Dexter Lee to be our tour guide. Casey Dexter Lee has lived and worked at Angel Island State Park for 20 years. She helped pilot the PORTS distant learning program in the park and became a lead to volunteers and interpretative in the staff. Casey has been in charge of the education programs on the island since 2017 and was part of the team that developed the park's interpretation master plan. Casey was the park's lead on the exhibition design team for the Angel Island Immigration Museum, which will open in 2021. Casey is a graduate of UC Santa Cruz, where she studied history and education. Before we ask Casey to give us a tour, I would like to let you know that this event is being recorded. Please mute your mic during the tour. And then we will have the Q&A session at around 4:50 p.m. Pacific time or 6:50 p.m. Central time. You can type in the questions in the chat box. Thank you for your collaboration. Casey, you have the floor.
All right, so I'm Casey and I work at Angel Island State Park. I'm an interpreter with California State Parks. Angel Island is one of 280 state parks in California. So we're very fortunate to have a lot of our natural and cultural resources as well as recreational resources protected here in California. Angel Island is the largest island in San Francisco Bay. So if you have been to San Francisco and look to the north, you'll see a really famous island. It's called Alcatraz, and we're right behind it. Most people don't know about Angel Island, so we are not surprised when this is a new thing for folks. But Angel Island is so large that it kind of blends in with the lands to the north in Marin County, which is where our park is located. The island is only accessible by boat. So there are ferries that come out of San Francisco as well as Tiburon to bring visitors to the park, as well as recreational boaters. I'm on the north side of Angel Island, and we are kind of facing towards Marin and the Richmond San Rafael Bridge, if you're familiar with this part of the bay. And what I would like to do is pull up a little photo to help you kind of visualize where we are in the grand scheme of things. And as the largest island in the bay, we do have a long history. The island has been occupied for thousands of years. The first people to live here were the Coast Miwok people, and they used boats to travel back and forth as well. They used small tule reed boats called wa'ote, and the islands, sorry, I can't find that photo, but the immigration station was built to try to enforce those laws that Ben mentioned, the Chinese Exclusion Laws and other anti-immigration laws that restricted who was allowed to come and go. So when the immigration station was built, the island had already been in use as an army post. So the U.S. Army was here from 1863 to 1962, running concurrently with the operation here at the immigration station. There was also a quarantine station here on the island from the 1890s to the 1940s. So the immigration station was partially built here because there was already a quarantine station, which was another aspect of immigration screening that the Immigration Service wanted to be able to do. So they start building here in 1905. There's a little hiccup in 1906. If you're familiar with San Francisco and California history, you know 1906 is the year of the big one. There's a massive earthquake in San Francisco, and that earthquake actually doesn't cause a lot of issues here on Angel Island, but because of the damage that's done in San Francisco from the earthquake itself and the fires, it changes the course of Chinese immigration to the United States. When the earthquake hits, one of the buildings that's ultimately destroyed is City Hall, where they keep all the records, including birth records. And because of the restrictive Chinese exclusion laws, you could not, one of the few classifications that were allowed to come here were children of American citizens. And as been mentioned, you're not allowed to naturalize as a Chinese immigrant to become an American. So the only way to be Chinese American at that time was to be born here. But there were very few Chinese women here. And so there were very few Chinese Americans being born. After the 1906 earthquake, when the birth records are destroyed, the city wants to have records and asks the people, the community, to come forward and tell them if they were born here. Well, as you can imagine, if that happened to the records that exist today, we would get some new citizens. And they got some new citizens in 1906. People came forward. They said they were born here. Oh, darn, my records were destroyed, and became overnight American citizens, avoiding these anti-Chinese laws. So when they got their citizenship, they also wrote down the names of their children that might want to come from China and join their father here in the United States. Now, we know that those names were probably exaggerated because it turned out statistically to be about 9 boys for every 1 girl being reported as children, which is unlikely that there were 90% males being born in villages back home. But that meant identities that could be sold to people who wanted to come here. And we call those folks paper sons and paper daughters. And this is a phenomenon that existed prior to the '06 earthquake, but on a much smaller scale. So it's no coincidence in 1910, Angel Island opens up to deal with what the American government referred to as the Chinese problem. And the job here was to screen people, to decide who was telling the truth and who was not, and try to deport people. This facility, when it opened, was called the finest immigrant station in the world. It was not. Within 2 years, massive renovations were being done to this site because of its shortcomings. So we have people coming in from all over the world to Angel Island. About 80 different countries are represented by the immigrants that passed through here. Chinese immigrants were the largest group, about 1/3 of all of the people that came. Japanese immigrants were second place, about 1/3, a little less than Chinese immigrants. And third and fourth place are also kind of a tie between Indian and Russian immigrants. So it's all Pacific migration for the most part. There are a few Europeans, although Russians were considered Europeans, but a few folks from the continent of Europe coming, but mostly through either around South America or through the Panama Canal once that opens up, but in much smaller numbers. So the story here is typically one of exclusion. The Immigration Service, while in the newspapers, people might have called this the Ellis Island of the West, the people who worked here called this place the Guardian of the Western Gate. Their job was to keep people out. And so what's happening is people arrive and they put their luggage into a big storage shed out on the dock. The large ship would actually come into San Francisco Bay, and then smaller ferries would bring you here to Angel Island. And those ferries would arrive directly at the immigration station. You would come down the long dock after putting your luggage into the storage building. So that's one of those ferries meeting up with that ocean-going ship. And then the storage shed is out on the back left. And folks would leave their larger items there. You could bring small items into the barracks with you. And you could go to the storage building about once a week to change things out. And you would come into the administration building. The administration building was the heart of the facility. And so you would come in, they would segregate people, and they segregated in a few different ways. There was racial segregation here in 3 categories. They separated people, the Immigration Service separated people into European, Asian, and Chinese. Now, most of us know that China is on the continent of Asia, and that Chinese people are generally considered Asian. But because of the separate and more restrictive laws for Chinese people, they were held separately from other Asians. The other possible motivation behind that is that the second largest group of Asians are coming from Japan. And China and Japan do have a long history of conflict, and especially between 1910 and 1940. So we have folks coming in to the administration building. They're being racially segregated by sex. Men and women are separated. They are separated by class. That was based on the ticket you had on the ship. So first class, second class, and third class, also known as steerage. And you are also separated by health. So if you were healthy, you would come here to the barracks, the building I'm in. And if you were sick, you would go to the hospital. Now, everyone had a quick initial screening and then more in-depth screenings for health to determine whether you'd be allowed to immigrate or not. But I'd like to turn the camera here and show you the barracks room that I'm in. And this room is the Chinese men's barracks. This is one of 2 rooms that were dedicated solely to detaining Chinese men here at the immigration station. They didn't hold any other groups during the immigration period. Now, the room is quite large. It goes on and on down there. And these beds are reproductions of what was here historically. They're actually triple layer bunk beds. So there's a bed down by my knee, a bed about waist high, and a bed right at the top of my hat. Now, I'm on the tall side. The top of my hat's about 6 feet off the ground. And there's no ladders on these beds. So you simply step on the beds of the people below to get up to the top. The beds also do fold up. So if it was unoccupied, you could remove the bedding and lock the bed in an upright position to make a little more room in the space. But because the movement in the room was restricted by being occupied by so many beds, you can actually see a worn pattern on the floor from where people walked up and down this kind of row in between the beds. This room was considered healthy for 25 people, according to health standards of the time. But this room held up to 100 people. There's 100 beds in this space. So about 4 times the healthy capacity. The room itself is actually a little different than it would have been when the immigration station was open, because this building had a second life as a prisoner of war and internment during World War II of Japanese Americans. There was a wall added in the center here. So actually during the immigration era, this room was twice as big, held 50 or healthy for 50 and a capacity of 200. So you would have had up to 199 roommates in this space. Now, the room wasn't always filled with people because of the nature of boats bringing people. The numbers would rise when boats arrived and be very crowded. As people were released, they would numbers would come down, so more beds would be vacant. Another boat would come, and those numbers would rise again. Now, most people had to stay here for 2 to 3 days. So that isn't a terribly long stay. Still could be very stressful for people not knowing that that was how long they were going to be here. Every day was the longest day if it wasn't the day you were leaving, and you didn't know you were leaving until they told you were leaving. The average stay is 2 to 3 days, but that is unless you're coming from China. Chinese immigrants have an average stay of 3.5 weeks, which is not very representative of what people actually experienced. Most Chinese immigrants were here 2 or 3 days, like other immigrant groups on Angel Island, or 3.5 months. And then you get that average of 3 weeks. So you're kind of here for a few days or a few months. Now, the few months typically means that you have done at least an administrative appeal. It means you've already failed and you're trying to appeal deportation, because 50% of the Chinese immigrants failed the entry hearing process. Now, this is actually the same failure rate as people coming from India. They also failed 50% of the time. Unfortunately, people from India had the highest deportation rate, which was 50%, basically everyone that failed that entry hearing. The Chinese immigrants had a much lower deportation rate, a little less than 10%. And that is because of the long history of Chinese immigration to the US. It is because of the long history of discrimination against Chinese immigrants in the US, and the long history of Chinese immigrants and Chinese Americans fighting that discrimination. So because of early discrimination, early laws that restricted and impeded the lives of Chinese and Chinese Americans in the US, they had learned how the courts in the US worked. They had the knowledge that lawyers were essential to fighting these discriminatory laws. And so people here would hire lawyers. They had support systems within the community to help people get access to those lawyers. And they had systems in place to help people pay for them if they didn't have the ability to do it directly themselves. And so lawyers made a huge difference in the appeals process. Now, the catch was, as a detained immigrant, you couldn't actually talk to your lawyer or meet with your lawyer, but the lawyer could act on your behalf. And that was what made the big difference, is filing these appeals, fighting deportation. But just because you fought deportation does not mean you get to leave here quicker. Some people, the longest people to stay here, stayed here because they appealed their deportation. The longest stay on record is a woman who was here for almost 2 years, 22 months. And that was because she was appealing deportation the entire time. Ultimately, she was allowed to stay, but the second longest stay at 20 months was deported. So it didn't necessarily guarantee a successful outcome if you were here longer or fighting that deportation. So the folks staying here, as I mentioned, they were fighting the deportation, but there was also other ways that people were resisting what was happening to them. And one of the ways was through graffiti. Now, we don't necessarily think of the writing on the walls in this building as graffiti today, but it is historic graffiti. The people who were here were not allowed to write on the walls. If they had been caught, they would have gotten into trouble. But today, we really appreciate the writing on the wall. And actually, the writing here saved this building from being destroyed. In the late 60s, early 70s, the goals for this part of the island were to turn it into a picnic area with campgrounds. It is the nicest side of the island. It's the most sheltered from the wind, has the best weather. And state parks was very much about getting people outside to enjoy nature. And they were going to get rid of, they being the people, California state parks. We were going to burn down these old abandoned buildings and have nice flat spots for all that camping and picnicking. But luckily there was a ranger who worked here at the time who saw the writing in the building, and others had seen it too. But the difference that Alexander Weiss made is that he went and told people about it. He was taking some classes at San Francisco State, and he started talking to folks there. And some of the professors started bringing their students out on informal field trips. Now, this is about 1970, and it's San Francisco State has a brand new Asian Studies department. And so a lot of those students, when they went home from their trip to Angel Island, went and spoke to their parents about it and said, hey, I went to this amazing place. It's called Angel Island. And for some of those students, it was the first time that their parents told them that they had been here as immigrants themselves. And so it was a chapter of our history that people were not talking about. A lot of times when people go through difficult times, they go through struggles, they don't necessarily want to continue to talk about those things. But for a lot of people who had come under false pretenses or less than honest pretenses, they were concerned about being deported. Now today, no one would be deported for coming in as a paper son or paper daughter during this era. But so people are a little more vocal about it, but there aren't a lot of people surviving today that were detained here on Angel Island because it closed so long ago. Most of the people would be in their 90s now. So on the writing on the walls, this was our chance to listen to the people who had been here. And that's why this historic site is such a special resource. Most historic places will often, use that cliche that we love to hear in an old building, if these walls could talk. And here on Angel Island, the walls of the barracks speak volumes. And they speak from the perspective of the people who were not necessarily winning this interaction in history. These are people being detained. There's bars on the windows. There's a fence with barbed wire around this building. There's another fence around this site with barbed wire to separate it from the rest of Angel Island. And then it's an island surrounded by water. So you'll hear in the poems, and most of the writing is poetry, people refer to themselves as prisoners, as this place as a prison. And we hear the gambit of emotions. There's poetry about the long journey on the ship. There's poetry about the bad food in the dining hall. There's poetry about being deported. There's poetry about being allowed to land. There's poetry about the invasive medical exams, and there's even poetry about the poetry. And so everything that people were experiencing is coming in these poems. It's showing up in what they're writing. So I'd like to read a translation of this poem for you. These colored squares, I can kind of zoom in here for a moment. These colored squares are actually the different layers of paint that are on the walls. And as I mentioned before, this was historic graffiti, and as graffiti today is often, it was painted over. The yellow and gray, so what most of the walls look like, are actually from that World War II period, from prisoner of war and Japanese American internment. And then we go back in time to the bare wooden walls before they started painting over the writing. So this is just part of a poem. The poem actually starts above these squares and goes on below it. And the translation is 1,000 sorrows and a hatred 10,000-fold burns between my brows. Hoping to step ashore the American continent is the most difficult of difficulties. The barbarians imprison me in this place. Even a martyr or a hero would change countenance. So he's saying that even the best of us would be changed by this place. He's not saying he's any great hero, right? He's saying even someone better than me would change after being here. And so we get a lot from these poems. This one obviously is packed with a lot of anger and frustration. There are poems that are more hopeful. There are poems that are warnings to the next people to come through this building. And, you know, when folks were writing these poems, they didn't necessarily know this place would become a museum, right? They're writing it for each other, for themselves. But we are in this unique position to be able to listen to them. Even if they're not here to personally tell us their stories, we can feel what they were feeling in that moment. Now, not all the poems are good. Some of the poems are written at different skill levels, education levels, but a vast majority of the poetry is at least an 8th grade education. For the time in China, that's very high. And so there's references to other poems, there's references to historical and cultural events. And so we can see a lot about the person who wrote the poem in how they express themselves. So I want to make sure I'm not doing too bad on time. So I was going to take you for a little close-up of some non-poetry, because not everybody is a poet. So there are drawings in this building as well. Just going to see if we can try and get you a close-up of one of our drawings here. And this one might require some creative lighting. So I'm going to get out my creative lighting tool. And we'll do our very fancy zoom feature. And right here is a fish. It's a little hard to see. Where are you, fish? There you are. I think that's a little better. So he starts here and goes all the way to here. It's quite large. But there are drawings of all kinds of things on the walls. There's fish, there's birds, there's a shrine, actually 2 shrines carved into the walls to create places for prayer. So this shrine is actually on the wall right here. Again, very difficult to see unless you're in the building with me. But this is a drawing of this intricate carving. And this is about 4 feet tall in the building. And this is a shrine for Chiming, which is the grave sweeping festival, where you honor ancestors, cleaning up the grave, give food offering, burn incense, give paper. And what's unusual about this shrine is that it actually has the names of multiple families, where typically it would just have your family name on it. And that's because we think people were sharing this resource in the building, because you didn't necessarily have the ability or the skill or the tools for everyone to create their own shrine. This one was shared. All right, I think we can probably start taking questions. I do like to remind everyone that immigration is not something from long ago, right? Immigration is something that's happening today. And we really hope that people that learn about Angel Island and the story here take some of those stories and think about the immigration situation today. There are more people in detention, in immigration detention today than ever in history. So the detention of people trying to immigrate is not an old thing. It is not something that has gone out of fashion. Now, immigration works differently today than it did during this era. During this era, this was the expected way to immigrate. You would come, you would be screened, and then you would either be deported or allowed in. There wasn't a lot to do in your port of origin before you came, but we still struggle with immigration. And I think it's very important for people to have conversations about immigration, because if it was an easy thing to, tidy up and have everybody like, it probably would have been done a while ago. So it's something that people need to continue to have conversations about. And we hope that learning a little bit about this history helps spurn those conversations amongst your family and friends.
Thanks, Casey. I have a few questions in the chat box. Let me read them out and have you answer those questions. The first question was, what are the lasting impacts from the immigration restrictions that we can see in Chinese Americans' lives today?
Yeah, absolutely. Some of the impacts were very obvious at the time, because it was harder for women to come. There were far fewer women immigrating, about 7 men for every 1 woman. That also has to do with the fact that many people were coming for laboring jobs, which tend to, historically as well as today, tend to slant more male in their occupation. Women also got paid less. I shouldn't say that in the past tense. Women get paid less on average than men, but historically those differences were even more dramatic. And so it was also more economical for men to come. They would get paid more when they did come. So we see additional restrictions on women's immigration, especially from Asia and China in the 1920s. So we have a bachelor class. There's a whole generation of men that were either separated from their families back in China or never married because it was difficult for women to come. I think you might be able to extrapolate some distrust between some communities and government or authority because of the historic laws. In 1943, the Chinese Exclusion Law is repealed because the US and China become allies during World War II. Now, this was not necessarily the generous repeal of this law that we might hope it was, but it was much more of a geopolitical maneuver. FDR was the president at the time. He gave a grand speech and he said, nations like individuals sometimes make mistakes, but then imposed the quota on China, which other Asian countries were already subject to. So about 100 people were allowed to come from China every year after 1943, which is actually less than what was allowed during exclusion. So it was very much a political move, not necessarily trying to restore relations between the countries. It really isn't until 1965 when Asian immigration is put on the same playing field as immigration from other parts of the world. We also see the last group of Asians able to naturalize in the 1960s were people from Japan. People from China got that right a few years earlier. So it delays your ability to make connections in the US if you're not allowed to naturalize, if you're for many of the early years you weren't allowed to own property. There were in the mining era there was a foreign miners tax. You had to pay a tax for being foreign in California, and you couldn't attend public schools. All of these things accumulate in how people are able to gain wealth, gain property, and can affect generations of people. So I think there's a lot of lasting effects.
Thanks. The second question was, were children, detained, at Angel Island?
Yes, they were. So I actually moved to the other half of that same room, and there's some historic photos in here. And you can see on the edges of the photo here are people that are quite young. They look to be, 10, 12 years old, probably. 12 years old was considered kind of old enough to come to the US. And because a lot of people were coming with false papers, they had a dollar amount associated with those documents. It was about $100 for each year of life you claimed. So if you're 10 years old, it costs $1,000 to get an identity. So there is a benefit to coming a little younger. It doesn't cost as much money. But these kids, if you were kind of 12, you're kind of old enough to come to the US and join your father. He might come and pick you up, or you might be sent to join him already here in the US. But because most people are coming as the son of an American citizen, or maybe a son of a merchant, they typically haven't seen their dad a lot. I interviewed someone from China that had come fairly young, but for our new exhibit space at Angel Island Immigration Museum, he said that because so many of the fathers in his community, in his village, had come to the United States for work, that he actually didn't know that fathers existed because there were no fathers in his community. And he wasn't until he was about 5 or 6 years old that he realized that fathers were something that existed in the world. And that is another kind of maybe lasting effect of these family separations. So these boys are probably coming to join a father here in the United States. And boys stayed with the men, with the exception of children under 12. They would stay with their mom if they were traveling with their mother. But many of these boys would either be traveling on their own, or their dad may have come and picked them up. But their dad, because he's already been here, would not have to be detained again at Angel Island. He would have filed a lot of paperwork before he departed the United States to make sure his re-entry went smoothly. And so he would be able to get off the boat directly in San Francisco, and then the child would potentially end up here by themselves. So there absolutely were kids detained here. From other countries, it was a lot more family groups, especially like Russia. A lot of the Russians coming are fleeing persecution, fleeing war. A lot of Russian Jews came through here. So that's a lot more family groups where people are more together with more women, especially. But yes, definitely for Chinese immigrants, young people were often on their own.
Thank you. There's another question, regarding the carvings. You just showed us, some, carvings of the Chinese poet and pictures. Why these carvings were not erased?
So the Immigration Service tried very hard to erase them, actually. The paint on the walls is just one layer of trying to erase them. The carved poems were also filled in with putty, and that putty is very old, so it has shrunk. And so what we're seeing is basically that slight indent from the shrinking putty. And that's why the lighting is really important, because it casts these shadows that make it a little easier for us to see. And those squares that I showed with the different paint colors, that was actually an experiment. State Parks hired some basically art restoration specialists, scientists, to see if the paint could be removed, how many layers of paint there were, what would happen if we removed the paint. Ultimately, it cost about $100 to remove one of those squares over one character. And so it's very costly and a large structure to remove the paint. But the other part is that we know that there is some writing in between those layers in pencil and ink. And so we don't necessarily want to remove all the paint because we might damage what's hiding in between. And then on the top layer, there are some writings from the World War II period, from particularly Japanese Hawaiians and a few Japanese and German prisoners of war. So we don't want to do any harm to the stories that are here in the building. So really, we're kind of hoping for technology to evolve that will allow us to see in between the layers without physically damaging them. If any of you would like to invent such a thing, we are open to it. But they are having some success with that in fine art paintings, where they are able to look under and in between the layers of paint to see the underpaintings. Now, our building isn't necessarily going to make the trip to that special machine in Europe to have that done, but eventually we hope technology will evolve to the point where we'll be able to do that in place. It's also another layer of complication because the paint is very old, so it's lead paint. So it's not as easy to look through those layers.
Thank you. Another question was, what did the Chinese detainees eat? Did they eat in a segregated in a dining area?
Yes, so there were segregated dining areas. They had two different dining areas. One was called the European dining area. The other was labeled the Asiatic dining area, a term we don't generally use to refer to people anymore. There were two different seatings in the Asian dining hall, one for Asians, meaning all people that weren't Chinese, and a Chinese seating. Initially, when the immigration station opened, they had one meal for everyone, more European style, so more stews, everything in one pot. The Chinese immigrants protested. They wanted food that was more familiar. And so from the Chinese immigrant perspective is they had a protest. From the immigration official perspective, there was a food riot. So it depends which side of the story you believe, but it was successful. They brought in Chinese cooks. And so then they started having two meals, a European meal and an Asian meal. The Asian meal was actually Chinese style food because the Japanese complained that the food was Chinese. So no one was really happy. The quality of the food was very poor. They were spending very little per meal, and they actually spent a little bit less per meal for the Asian meals than the European meals. So not a lot of meat, mostly rice, vegetables, but not necessarily cooked well because it's cooked in mass. So there's, as I mentioned, there's poems about the bad food. There's one that talks about they treat us Chinese badly and feed us yellowed greens. My weak physique cannot take it. I am truly miserable. So there's, definitely, if you had friends or relatives nearby that could send you food to supplement, if you had money, you could buy extra food and things from the dining hall. So there definitely are differences in experiences based on wealth. It was definitely an easier, better experience if you had money. And it was also easier to immigrate if you had money. People traveling in first class typically didn't even have to come to Angel Island. First class passengers that ended up here typically arrived on the weekend when no one was processed, and they had to wait till Monday when the inspectors returned. But for most second and third class passengers, particularly if you're Asian, you would end up here.
Thank you. So another question, asked, we all understand that the Chinese underwent very extensive questioning. Did the other 80 some nationalities undergo the same level of interrogation?
Yeah, so I actually just happened coincidentally to move to a big, this was not staged, but this is a picture of entry hearing in process. Chinese immigrants often referred to this as an interrogation. This is actually a Japanese couple. It's a man here and a woman here. She's dressed in her kimono, and so you recognize that traditional clothing. So there's two inspectors, stenographer, and she potentially could be a translator. Not everyone that came here was able to communicate in English, so they did use translators. For Chinese immigrants, the vast majority are coming from the Pearl River Delta area, pretty small region in southern China. But, every village has its own dialect. And so you might not necessarily be speaking in the exact same dialect that you grew up in, especially if you're from one of those villages that isn't the most common that people were coming from. So that could be a level of difficulty in communication. But there were entry hearings for most people. For most people, it was very perfunctory. It was maybe 20 questions. They're asking, in the case of probably a Japanese picture bride, they're asking her just a few questions about whether she will be working outside the house. That's sort of a trick question. The answer has to be no. If you say yes, you can be deported for being brought in for labor. And the, so are you married to him? Are you going to work outside the house? Where are you going to live? For picture brides, they also had to remarry once they were here in the US because of the way the picture bride marriage worked in Japanese culture at that time. You were married separately. She was married to the man already living in the US in a ceremony in Japan without the groom. And so the US generally recognizes all foreign marriages, but this marriage they did not. And so women and men that were married in this tradition had to remarry once they were here in the United States for the US to recognize that marriage. The men in these situations that were usually already here in the US actually were asked more questions than their wives because they had to prove that they were able to support a wife. So they had to show how much money they had to have employment or business, and sometimes having witnesses, especially if you could find a white witness for any of the Asian immigrants here, that could really help your case because there was, the US government didn't trust most Asian immigrants or most Asian Americans to be telling the whole story. They wanted white witnesses, they wanted Christian witnesses, things like that, that the US government just had decided had more standing at that time. So it could be, pretty demeaning situation, but definitely briefer generally. There were also, for people from India, there were so many more reasons they could be deported because in addition to be considered Asian, many of them were poor. Many of them had been exposed to parasitic infections. So you could be deported exclusively for medical reasons and they didn't have to really even talk to you. And in fact, the the immigration officials worked with the doctors in the hospital to identify conditions and illnesses that were more common in regions of the world that they were trying to exclude people from. So they could make that illness deportable and then not have to go through as much process. They could just deport people on medical reasons. And in addition to that, people from India often were part of the Ghadar movement, which is the political movement to free India from British rule. The US at that time labeled people who wanted India to be free as political radicals. And it's interesting because there was this colony of Britain that wanted to free themselves from British rule in 1776. And it turned into this place called the United States. And, 150 years later, there's a country with a similar story in India wanting freedom from British rule. And instead of looking at the Indian people as brothers or partners or allies, by then the US had repaired its relationship with Britain and sided with the British. So you could be deported if you wanted your country to have freedom.
Thanks. And that question asks, are these buildings open for tours?
So generally the barracks is open for tours. We're closed right at the moment, but we are hoping actually to reopen next week. I haven't put that out on official things yet, but we have set a date next week. And we will only be
doing
entrance into the space. We aren't going to be doing guided tours yet. Some of the rooms are
not very
small. And so we'll be letting folks come in and, check out the space on their own. There are some signs in the rooms to tell you a little bit about what you're seeing. If we have enough staff or volunteers, depending on how much our volunteers are willing to come back right now, we'll have to see how they're feeling about it. But we might be able to do some brief talks outside as staff or volunteers are available. And then we hope to open the Angel Island Immigration Museum later this year. We had hoped to open last year. There were some delays in the installation of the exhibits, but the exhibit work is done. We just have to do some finishing touches. And then we won't be doing a big grand opening as we had hoped, probably for another year or more, depending on how our public health situation goes. But we'll definitely do an opening where people can come and start visiting and open up the space.
Thanks. One of the audience, said that, his grandmother came through Angel Island in the spring of 1940. And he understands that there was a fire in a dormitory while she was there, and they had to relocate to the infirmary. Is that building still standing?
So the administration building burned down in August of 1940. So she might have been here right in August if she was here when that fire happened. And that building was destroyed. So that initially women and children lived in this building in separate rooms in the barracks. But because there were so many more men coming than women, they reconfigured the spaces. The barracks became solely for men, and women and children lived in the second floor of the administration building. So the infirmary or the hospital definitely could have been an alternate location to house people after that fire. That fire in the administration building was the beginning of the end of the operation of this site as an immigration station. The immigration service had been looking to leave Angel Island. It's inconvenient to be on an island. The initial reasons of isolation and quarantine and being hopefully escape proof that put the immigration station here in the first place were being countered by the expense, the inconvenience, the logistical challenges of having a facility on an island. And so after the end of the year, by the end of 1940, the facility is moved off the island completely. I can reverse my camera here and show you the print out the window. So as I was saying, there is this caging over the windows. This is the historic, but if you look beyond that, there's some tables down below. This is that back corner. So this is actually the Asian dining hall. The European dining hall was here. And then the building continues towards the waterfront. There's a covered staircase that connects the administration building up to the barracks where we are. That was destroyed and torn down in the fire as well, but we rebuilt it so that you could come into the building in a more authentic experience. But once you were inside those buildings, you really didn't go outside except in the fenced in areas. You were being detained. And so you were not free to come and go as you pleased.
Also, what, precipitated the closure of Angel Island as an immigration station?
So definitely that fire was the kind of the straw that led to the actual closure. And then after the building burned, the facility was empty for about a year. And then in December of 1941, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the first prisoner of war, World War II, was held here, Kazuo Sakamaki, who was a Japanese midget submarine pilot. And so it had this second life during World War II, and then closed down in 1946 for good. So the building was abandoned for many years and in pretty poor condition. So in the 1970s is when that movement to save the building starts. By the early 90s, we have the ability to take folks into the first floor of this building. And then in the mid 2005 is when the construction that really did a big renovation on the site and the building. So we reopened to the public in 2009. And so now we can go into both floors of the building. Typically, we're open Wednesday through Sunday, but especially because of the unpredictability of everything these days, definitely contact the park or check our website, parks.ca.gov/Angel Island. Or you can email us at tours, tours.angelisland@parks, parks.ca.gov, as in California government.
Thanks. I think we have time for one last question. So did every immigrant has a legal paper when they arrive?
So during the immigration era, zero did, because there was no such thing. This is old school Ellis Island style immigration. You show up and you're there. So they started having some requirements for certain parasitic infection screenings before you departed, but there was a lot of corruption in foreign ports, so it was pretty easy to get papers, even if you hadn't really passed the test. And there was a lot of corruption where doctors would make people pay for treatment before they were allowed to leave for illnesses they didn't even have. So it really is extremely different than modern immigration. It's more on par of what we would experience with modern refugee immigration, where people show up because they need to leave. They don't have a choice to stay behind. And some of the people here would absolutely be considered refugees in modern legal views of immigration. But that was not a term or a classification at that time. There were no such thing as refugees as a legal status. So everyone here was going through the process as it was set up. But that's why the process also changed, because the wait times for immigration in many countries today can be years or even decades. And if we had the older style of process where you showed up and they held on to you while they figured out if you were allowed to stay, we'd have people incarcerated for potentially decades waiting for the okay to be released. So that's one of the reasons that immigration works differently today.
Thank you, Casey. We all very enjoy about this virtual tour, and some of the audience said that this is a very interesting and most informative tour, and she hopes that to visit the facility one day. Again, thank you very much.
Thank you. I hope you are able to visit. If not, we'll see you online.
Thank you, and thank you all for joining us for this tour. Thank you. Bye bye. Have a nice evening.